So if you've been paying any attention at all, you'll have noticed that Ryzen 7000 or Zen 4 has some serious issues. Let's talk about them. So I know, and I've been paying attention, that the Ryzen 7000 is extremely fast. In gaming, the R5 7600 does beat the i9 12900K, depending on the game. So a CPU that costs half as much and plays games just as well, that's where the nice parts end. All of that performance comes at a tremendous cost. The Ryzen 7600X is only a $300 chip, but that chip is an LGA chip, so the pins are on the motherboard. That's pretty standard nowadays, right? The part that people don't mention is that when you do that, yes, you can fit more pins onto a single CPU, making them smaller, because you don't have to insert them, and you can just afford to make them smaller. You also increase manufacturing costs of the board when you do that, so now either you're buying a more expensive motherboard than you normally would otherwise, or you're losing out on features you would have otherwise kept. This is evident by a quick Google search, saying that the cheapest motherboard currently on the market for this CPU is roughly $250. It's almost the cost of the CPU. This is also normal. People on Intel have been dealing with this for years. Normally, they also get to carry over their RAM. For whatever reason, this generation AMD is only allowing Ryzen 7000 to use DDR5. And unless you're upgrading from a 12th gen Intel CPU, which honestly isn't that much of an upgrade, you're talking a couple of percentage points at best and losing performance at worst. You don't already have DDR5, so you have to buy some. The cheapest DDR5 kit I could find was roughly $150, and that's on sale, with average prices being about $280 for a 32 gig kit at roughly 6400 megahertz. And did I mention you can't get 16 gig kits, so you're at a 32 gig minimum. You can get 16 gig sticks, but not kits, so you can run it in single channel, but for dual channel operation you're at a 32 gig minimum now, which is nice, right? DDR5 is a lot better, but it is also more expensive, and it's your only option with Ryzen 7000, so you're then increasing costs. So now with the cost of a CPU and RAM, you're at what, $450? Add in a new motherboard and you're up to $700 already just for a CPU upgrade. And that's not to mention that none of these Ryzen 7000 chips that are out right now, none of them have CPU coolers. So there's another $50 to $150, so your upgrade is now easily in the $900 price point for a Ryzen 5. Throw a Ryzen 9 at it and you're over the $1,000 mark, which, honestly, for people buying those chips probably isn't a huge deal, but that's not a small chunk of change. Especially considering you can get a Ryzen 7 5800X3D for $400, spend less on the rest of the system, and have a rig that performs the same or better in gaming for less money overall. Because the cost of the RAM and motherboard are half as much for DDR4. Another problem I don't really see people considering is what happens when brand new technologies are released into the wild for the first time. So take my 12th gen rig, for example. It is by far the fastest computer I've ever personally had, but it is also by far the most unstable. Its stability has been improved over time with BIOS and Windows updates, but even now it's still what I would consider to be fairly unstable. Intel has learned some lessons from that whole experience of Intel's 12th gen. AMD hasn't gone through that yet, and it hasn't gone through that in a while. So I think Ryzen 7000 is likely going to be very unstable, which isn't a huge problem for gaming rigs, but it is a huge problem for anybody doing any sort of productivity work with their PCs, like me, video editing. doubling the chance of a system crash, even from a very small chance to a slightly larger chance, is still a big deal, especially when your system runs a lot of the time. And I would consider, something like streaming to be productivity work, because you can't afford to have your PC going down in the middle of a stream. And you add all of that together, and you have a platform that is indeed one of the fastest in history, but is also one of the most expensive. You're definitely paying the early adopter tax, just like we did with the first generation Ryzen systems. And like the first generation Ryzen, it's going to be a couple of generations before I can really recommend it. Take everything I've said with a grain of salt, though, because at the end of the day, this is an unproven platform. History says we should be careful about new platforms, and I'm going to be careful about it. Because I honestly think that if you remember back to the first generation of Ryzen, there were issues in Windows all the time. There was just issues with first generation Ryzen, and I think we're going to see a lot of those issues come back to the surface, because I think we took a reset, kind of. As AMD made a new platform, they don't do that very often, and it's going to take some time for all of the issues and kinks of Ryzen 7000 to work itself out. I think Ryzen 7000 is going to be a lot like Ryzen 1000. We're going to see issues, and as we see Ryzen 8000 or 9000, they're going to have less and less issues, and I really think the time to buy is going to be either, it is going to be in about 2 generations. Because the second generation, so Ryzen 8000, is going to be like Ryzen 2000 was. Slightly faster than the first generation, but a lot more stable. And then the generation after that is where I think it's really going to kick off, just like it did the first time. So I think that's what we need to wait for, and that's what I want to see. But if you do plan on buying Ryzen 7000, let me know. I want to see how it performs. I want to see how things happen, how it turns out. And that's all I've got for today. I will see you guys in the next one. Hope you guys are enjoying these Sunday videos. Let me know in the comments if you are. I've got a pretty quiet subscriber base nowadays, but I'll see you guys in the next one.